and Simeon Booker.
That sounds good. Okay.
How's Judge doing?
Go ahead, say hello.
Judge, you want to talk to me a little bit?
All right.
How was your ride this morning?
It was very pleasant. It's a nice blue sky. A little bit hot, but that's okay.
Construction?
Yes, wasn't too much construction. A lot of state patrolmen along the way, but I was not driving, so I wasn't worried about it.
Okay, all right, we're ready.
All right. So Judge, let's just picking up with where we were talking earlier. Your fondness for Youngstown, it's never left you, regardless of where you call home. What are some aspects of Youngstown that helped shape how your life was and who you are today?
Well, Youngstown, as you note, has been my home. I was born and raised here. No matter where I've gone since leaving Youngstown, I've always claimed Youngstown. Whether I was traveling within the United States or traveling internationally, because Youngstown has meant a lot to me. Even though there were challenges of various kinds, we were living at the time of my birth in my early years. Our society was a Jim Crow society. We were living during the period of Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a case that legitimized racial segregation. And that could have been a condition that repelled me and could have caused me to be depressed and not feel I could achieve. But the influences that were provided to me that impacted me while in Youngstown from the time I was just a kid had the opposite effect. I was inspired by individuals, inspired by opportunities that were presented in order for me to conclude that I was not a part of the caricature that had been described for black people. I just refused to allow others to define me. And there were persons and institutions in this city that assisted me in that. The West Federal YMCA branch, which was directed by Simeon Booker's father, who was Reverend Booker and also pastor of our church. He organized each year Sunday afternoon forum meetings at which outstanding speakers came and addressed the issues of the day, notably the racial issues. Though I was a sub-teen and then later a teen, I was in the audience. My mother took me to those forums and I sat on the first row and listened to the speakers. Later I had a chance to meet the speakers and shake their hands, and that encouraged me to believe that change was possible, that living in a period of Jim Crow and segregation need not be the final verdict. And so I was always inspired to work for change, but that inspiration came to me even though I was living in an environment in Youngstown that was not so conducive to that. There were other forces that encouraged me to believe that other things, progress notably, could be achieved.
What are your most special places that you remember as a child of Youngstown? A chance to visit them today still, but when you think about growing up here, places?
Well, my neighborhood. I lived I was born on what was known as Smoky Hollow in Youngstown, but at a very young age. In fact, I was probably less than 2 years old. My family moved over to the lower south side. And that was a neighborhood where I spent a good deal of my youth. It was close to Mill Creek Park, Volley Rogers Playground, Ward Baking Company, and was there. I was there when Isley Dairy was being built on Moaning Avenue. The opportunities to interact with children of the opposite race were afforded. The neighborhood was mixed. It was an interracial neighborhood to a point. I say to a point because there were some unwritten rules that govern relationships with neighbors of the opposite race. While we were friendly, I don't ever recall my parents visiting in the home of a white neighbor. I don't remember a white neighbor ever visiting in our home. They would sit on the front porch and they would chat. We kids played, we seldom went into each other's homes, but there was just that understanding that there were of certain limitations, certain lines. There were public spaces and public areas that invited all persons to participate. One was Mill Creek Park, the Bolly Rogers Playground. But even there were limitations. The tennis courts and all of the equipment that was there for recreation, all of the opportunities for doing handicraft work and learning, they were all open to children, black and white. But on Tuesday morning, the white children were taken to swimming lessons over to Bort's Pool, which was on the west side. The black children, of which I was one, we were taken on nature hikes. And I kept asking, why couldn't we go to Bort's Pool and learn how to swim? Well, the Bort's Pool was operated by the city Park and Recreation Commission, as were all the swimming pools in the city. They had a ban against black children swimming in those pools, with one exception called Lincoln Pool. That was a segregated pool that was available on the east side. But the other 5 pools in the city were not available to blacks. And I kept asking the question, why? I never could get an answer. There was considerable embarrassment, but that was something that was out of the hands of the Mill Creek Park playground officials. Now, I think that was a point in time in which a display of courage could have probably brought that issue to the fore, and maybe it could have been resolved at that time, at a much earlier time in my life, but nobody ever challenged that except some members of the black community.
At such a young age, you were asking why, and why, and why. Where did that come from in you? Where do you think you got the streak within you to ask why? Well,
I knew that my white playmates wondered too. And we could do all these things together at the playground and in the neighborhood. But there were certain things we couldn't do together. And it made no sense. In our neighborhood, we played together. We climbed trees. We ran through yards. We did a number of things. And one of our playmates was a boy who lived up on the corner in a very well-to-do house. He was being raised by his grandmother, and we would be having a great time out playing. And then I'd hear this voice bellow from the back porch of that big house, "Bobby, get in here." And that's when she would see him playing with black kids, and she would summon him to the house. And his feathers just fell. He said, "Oh, I've got to go in." Well, he had to go in because his grandmother looked out there and saw him playing with black kids. That was a tragedy for that kid. And what I came to conclude, not only then but later, that condition, that segregation, was a condition that was offensive to whites as well as blacks, and it would take courage on the part of blacks to help whites understand. And I was in the role sometimes of helping whites understand why they couldn't play with us. I asked the questions, but I knew the answer. And I would say, because we're colored. They say, well, what difference does that make? I said, it doesn't make any difference, except your parents don't want you to do this, the city doesn't want us to swim together, or we can't use the same roller skating rink, a whole variety of problems. And then going to the movies was the same thing. We could play together in the neighborhoods, but if we wanted to go to the movies, the white kids sat in one place and the black kids sat in another. That was something imposed, and I'd ask the question, why? It just points out that this whole business of racial segregation makes no sense. It is senseless. And as I look back now, down the corridors of my life, I'm 90 years old now, and as I look back, I see how senseless, and many whites that I talked to about what things were like in my youth, they agree it was senseless, and are I think, without question, many of them are embarrassed. To just cite another example, this doesn't involve Youngstown, this involves Cincinnati, but yet it involves a condition that exists in this country, and that's the legal community, the lawyers, the Bar Association. We had a condition in the legal community where black lawyers often were not permitted to join the white bar association or the main bar association. And so in some cases, the lawyers formed their own associations, black lawyers did. In Cincinnati, some years, wasn't too long ago, the Cincinnati Bar Association came to realize it had to do something to rectify that condition of its past. And so one of the lawyers it had excluded from membership, a very distinguished lawyer, was offered an honorary life award. And he agreed to accept it. He was up in years and he was losing his eyesight, and he could not read his speech. He didn't write his speech, he couldn't read it. So he was speaking extemporaneously. And he described what it was like for him back in the 30s to be rejected as a lawyer by that bar association and other things that were going on in that community. And now they were offering him this honorary lifetime award. He paused and he said, "But I forgive you." And as he paused and said, "I forgive you," the lawyers gasped, and the applause started very tepid, and it increased, and before I knew it, I was on the podium, and I looked out, they were on their feet. And as I looked out at that audience, there were tears on the cheeks of many of those lawyers. They were young lawyers. They didn't know anything about that history. But to be told that a man of this prominence, a man of notable achievement, had been turned down because of his color, they were overcome. It's that way in many avenues of life. When I go to a Major League Baseball game or a Major League Football game, and I see the makeup of the players, and I see that even in instances the coach of a professional football team is black, or a manager of a Major League Baseball team is black. That was something that wouldn't have happened in the 40s, because I witnessed the segregation in sports here in Youngstown. Youngstown would host a baseball tournament every year. It's called the National Amateur Baseball Federation. And because of the ball diamonds that were in Youngstown, they were always asked to host this tournament. Teams came from all over the country, but they had a policy: no black players. And when it became an issue through the NAACP, through the reports of the Buckeye Review and local leaders, that this was not right to use public facilities which these ball diamonds were, to entertain a tournament that excluded people on the basis of color. And this hero of mine, this mentor, Maynard Dickerson, pressed Mayor O'Neill, Ralph W. O'Neill, to do something about that. And he let the Park and Recreation Commission know that if that policy was not changed, that tournament could not be played here in Youngstown. And because of the mayor's firm position, speaking of leadership and courage, the policy was changed, and the first player to break that policy was a member of a team from Akron. And I remember going to that first game so vividly. It was called the Smith Sheriffs. The sheriff over in Summit County was named Smith, and he had a team. He was a sponsor of his team, and he had a black pitcher. And on the opening day out at Bailey Park, the mayor and my mentor went to the game, and they took me with them. I was allowed to go with them. And it was a big day when the NABF broke the color line and permitted a black player to play in that tournament. Now you look at that now and you say, oh, no, what was that? That was a little team in Akron and playing in Youngstown. But that was a milestone. And we had many milestones that had to be achieved, but people were learning. I just feel, when I look back, that we've made a lot of progress. But the senselessness of the conditions make people wonder how and why. And that was the question I always ask, why?
With everything you've talked about a little bit, you keep bringing up courage and courage and courage. With your work and your life and intellect, compassion, human qualities, where does courage rank in how one has to operate? One has to go. How often do you find yourself employing courage, taking a gulp, taking a breath, and saying, "We got to go"?
You know, I think about that at times, but I never thought of courage with regard to things I was doing. I felt strongly that certain things were wrong, and they had to be rectified. And if it was within my power to raise an issue about it, I would do it. And it got me in trouble sometimes, even at my church. When I read in the Vindicator one afternoon that there was going to be a church meeting at my church to discuss the effort to oust the pastor. And I was 10, 12 years old. And for that story and that issue to be a story, it was so embarrassing. So without saying anything to my parents, I just said, I'm going to the church meeting tonight. And in those days, you could walk all around town as a kid. You weren't restrained. So I told parents I was going to a church meeting, and I walked down to the church, and there was this meeting. There was a lawyer who was moderating it, and the contending forces, there had been a lawsuit filed to restrain the church from ousting the pastor. And so these two contending forces were having their argument and debate, and I asked to be recognized. And I walked up to the front and took the microphone and began to explain to those elders how wrong that was, how embarrassing it was to bring that kind of shame on the church. And I just babbled a while, and then I took my seat. Well, before I got back home that night, my mother knew about it, and I was severely chastised by my mom for, as she said, getting into grown folks' business. That wasn't something that a kid was supposed to be involved in, but I did it because I just felt that it was wrong. To me, that didn't take courage. Maybe a big mouth. maybe impulsiveness, but all down the line when I was at the university and we had that problem with the activities books, it was more a case of outrage than it was courage. I would sometimes be annoyed when we couldn't round up a sufficient number of allies to join us, but that didn't. I didn't think that necessarily took courage. Even going to the swimming pools when we'd be attacked by white swimmers. That it didn't take bravery. What I did in one instance, I went to a friend's house and we looked at his yearbook for Rand School. This is an event that took place at the Northside Pool. And we looked at the yearbook and I spotted the picture of a junior classman who was in the group that attacked us. And I went to City Hall the next day and filed a complaint with the city prosecutor and had him arrested. Well, I knew the law permitted that. I knew it was a violation of law to interfere with one's exercise of his constitutional rights under the Ohio Civil Rights Law. So there was an arrest. And but courage is must be an ongoing component. And while I didn't recognize that until years later, I guess there was courage in the things that I tried to do, but I didn't view it as courage at the time.
Using those two examples from your childhood, are there two life moments in the last 50 years of your legal career that you would hold out, similar to the pool incident and such, where you stood up and spoke out, or like the church incident? Two professional instances that you're most proud of, remember the most?
Well, one was when I went to South Africa. I was asked to go to South Africa in 1985 to serve as a trial observer for a number of blacks who were being prosecuted for treason and terrorism. At the time, I remember I was on the court. The first question I had to decide in my own mind was whether that would pose a conflict of interest for me as a judge in the United States to go to another country and observe the functioning of its criminal justice system, satisfying myself that there was no conflict. And my experience in South Africa had been nil. I knew about apartheid, and I knew the activities that had intensified there, and that there was a great deal of repression. I just had not thought about ever being a participant. But I advised the lawyers committee who had asked me if I would go, that I would. And as the time neared for me to go, I did begin to have qualms, because I was provided with information about the trials and about the defendants. I read the indictments. I read the bill of particulars that had been provided to their lawyers. I had been wary about persons charged with treason and terrorism, because I had a stereotypical notion about a terrorist. I figured a terrorist is someone who sneaks down dark alleys and throws bombs and kills people and creates havoc. But when I read the indictment and the bill of particulars and saw what these men and women were charged with, I concluded that what they had done and what they were charged with doing was no different from what our Constitution guarantees: the right to assemble, the right to speak, the right to protest. That's all they had been doing, protesting the apartheid system. And the government had initiated a series of repressive measures that led to their arrest and these criminal charges. So that helped me determine that I really was going, and I went. But while over there, I saw the horrors of apartheid. It exceeded anything I'd ever imagined. And I saw the sense of, at times, hopelessness on the part of the victims of apartheid, and yet their aspiration, their expectation of hope. And as I moved around the country, I just